Welcome to Mentoring Moments. Mentoring Moments is a sub-series of the eCommerce Edge podcast. It is composed of clips taken from Jason's one-to-one and group mentorship sessions. Yeah, good stuff. Adam, tell us about, there's been a lot that's happened with your business in the intervening few weeks or a month, just over a month to 6 weeks.
Particularly the last few months have been busy. And since I jumped into it full time, my partner Lyndall got a promotion. She's currently working for an e-commerce brand in the bike space. She works in customer service. So a lot of our insight has come from working for them. I used to work for them. I've now been in Bike Matrix full time for a couple of months since the beginning of December. And so we are effectively, how should I explain it? We're effectively taking the confusion away from the bike parts buying process. And there's a lot of confusion from bike owners about which parts fit their bike. And what we're doing is we're providing the compatibility algorithms as a back-end service so that e-commerce platforms can only show the customer the parts that are going to fit their bike. So it effectively removes all of the noise, increases their confidence, and thus increases conversion rates. A company in Christchurch called Partly are seeing conversion rates increase by 30 to 40% once customers are using their product. We ran a case study on Mountain Bike Direct, who we both were working for at the time. And on parts alone, which make up about 58% of what they sell, if we can increase their conversion rates by 30%, that equates to about $3.7 million a year in increased revenue. So it's not to be sneezed at.
Yeah, look, I don't know if you've ever heard of a company out of the States, but they have a significant presence in Australia. They're called Tech Alliance. I don't know if you've ever heard of Tech Alliance.
I only just came across them.
Yeah, they have a monopoly on the vehicle version of what you do. And so they have to work with them and deal with them. There's another outfit in Australia that's only operating in Australia called Auto Info that does the same thing, but they only do it for vehicles in Australia. They're not a global player, but the likes of eBay, Tech Alliance's database under license to sort out all of the fitment for all the auto parts. So basically, it's an automated way of cross-referencing the fitment data based on what's known as K-type, which is an industry standard of every single vehicle of every single year based on its make, the model, the year, and the variant. The K-type of a vehicle can change even mid-year if a vehicle changes mid-year. And so that's the central command center, if you will, or the SKU, if you will, that links together a vehicle with the fitment data. And they license it. They're very jealous of that data, protective of that data, because that's their IP. And so they're very cautious about how they let it out, about how you can interact with it, and it's even to the point where you can only subscribe to specific brands and suppliers of products. So let's say you want to have fitment data for, I don't know, Fram air filters, for example, or Fram oil filters, whatever it is, then you would subscribe to the Fram catalog, and there's a fee to subscribe to that catalog and to be able to extend that fitment data into a website, say, for example. And they control very heavily the amount of time that you can cache that data in your web, that cross-referencing data. In a perfect world, they would always want you to do it in real time and fetch the data in real time by querying their database at the time that you generate, for example, a category page. And let's say you have a My Garage functionality on the website where you load your 3 cars with their plate. So you have a plate lookup service that then generates the K-type, which gets associated with your vehicle in your garage. And then that K-type is then used to reference in real time in the category of products and the SKUs. It filters out the ones that don't cross-reference between your K-type and that particular category of products. So that's typically how it would work, and that's how it would typically be architected. Now, what we wanted to do is we wanted to be able to, for many retailers, that model doesn't work for them because they get their product data out of what's known as a PIM, a product information management system. And so they have all of the attributes of a product preloaded against that product, and then that data, including all of its attributes and fitment data, would get injected into the e-commerce website as attributes that then could be filtered in real time in the category just using front-end logic. And so that way you don't have the time overhead of having to load data in real time from a remote source. you have it already loaded in your website. And so it makes the whole experience much better and much faster for the customer as a result. And so sometimes those onerous access restrictions become unusable in an e-commerce environment. And so what we tried to work out with them, and I don't want to release anything commercial or anything like that, but what we opened a dialogue with Tech Alliance about was the fact that in the case where a brand uses a PIM system, or maybe they keep this data in an ERP, or they keep it, maybe even they just directly load it into their website via CSV file or whatever. What we said to them is, what's the difference if we load it in real time, or if we refresh that data set on a cron job every 24 hours or once every 5? So their whole goal, they're not trying to be assholes about it. What they're trying to say is fitment data changes so routinely that we don't want you giving out data if we have refreshed data. If we have updated data and you're not using it, let's say the data that you fetched from us is 6 months old. That now is going to give the end customer a bad experience with that brand of supplier because you are not giving accurate data. So if you're going to access our data, you need to refresh it. I think the minimum frequency is like every 72 hours or something like that. So they said, well, if you're going to host that data yourself, if you're effectively going to pull it from us, host it yourself, inject it into your system, then you need to refresh it on such and such a basis so that it's always current. If you're not going to do it real time, which is our preference, is to load it in real time. But if you're not going to do that, then you need to refresh it every so often. And so I'm very sensitive to the type of system that you're building, or I guess I'm very empathetic to not only the needs of you to protect what is a significant amount of IP, but also setting it up and structuring the subscription model in such a way that it can actually be consumed in a usable way by anybody who would want to consume your data and happily pay you for it. But then they could use it depending on how they have their tech stack configured. They may need to consume it in different ways, is what I'm saying. Sometimes they may need to pull it down on a set frequency basis. Some people are quite happy to pull it down on a real-time basis. And I'm guessing that you'll need to have a system very similar to the vehicle lookup system. Okay, here's the make, model, year of my bike or whatever it is, or here's maybe my aftermarket part that I've got on it that I need to replace or whatever it is. And then your system is going to say, okay, here's the cross-referencing between these parts that are in this category and whether it's going to fit your bike or not. And so a somewhat similar system, but similar challenges remain as in the automotive world, which is you've got this set of IP that's unique to you and you want to protect that, but you also want to make it as usable as possible so that you can land and net as many customers as possible for your data.
Yeah, and this for me is exactly why I joined this group because I knew our product was B2B focused, or B2B2C essentially. And so I wanted to see if anyone had insights on a similar kind of product. Had I known you had Tech Alliance and AutoEye experience, I probably would have harassed you a lot more than I already have. Tech Alliance was something that I only became aware of about a week ago.
Yes.
Through my connection to Partly, which are based in Christchurch. And I think what Partly are doing is they've essentially the marketing around their product as being this unique thing where they're creating the black box that's joining the data from several sources. They weren't obviously naming names about what those sources were. And so I thought they were doing something extremely unique, but essentially the unique thing that they've done, I believe, is they've gathered various data sources and created a global solution, which I guess the automotive market has been a little bit segmented in region by region. Cars are obviously spec'd differently. There are models that are available in some countries and not in others. And so I think what Partly are doing in a unique way is connecting all of that together. And that helps them obviously spread throughout the market and offer a global solution. Talking to their CEO, Nathan Taylor, he said one of the big surprise customers of theirs is the largest fleet in the world, and that's the UN. And so when the UN take half a dozen of their vehicles for use in a different country and they need spares, then their original or current sources for getting spares have disappeared. They're now in a different country. They need to find what the equivalent component is in that country, and that car may never have been available there. So their product allows them to effectively look that up and find a source of parts for that vehicle in that country. It's one particular use case, but obviously eBay, Amazon, those kinds of marketplaces is where they're making their big dollars. For me, I had a real aha moment when I looked at Tech Alliance and worked out that partly who are now this $200 million company after only 3 years, they've taken these other sources that already existed, this K-type, the VIN lookup, the Rego lookup, the Tech Alliance, they're bringing all of that together. And what I realized was there is nobody in the bike market that is doing that. And so that then opened up a new opportunity for me to, okay, who's going to define the K-type of bikes? Who's going to define the Tech Doc, which is a Tech Alliance product?
Correct. Yeah.
Defines the way that this product category or product information is structured and standardized so that it can be exchanged. Nobody does that in the bike industry. And so there's a reasonable opportunity there. I know the markets are different. My understanding is that the automotive parts market is somewhere in the vicinity of 2 trillion worldwide. Our bike and micromobility market is 260 billion. So it's a little bit smaller, but still not to be sneezed at.
It's not insignificant.
No, and it's growing. They're talking about annual growth rates in the vicinity of 17% for micromobility at the moment, which is pretty good kind of growth for a market, I would think.
Not only that, but obviously from what I've seen, the e-bike industry in particular, and obviously e-scooters and other forms of micromobility, electric micromobility, it has breathed completely new life into the bike industry. The bike industry obviously has had several boosts over the years, and the big move to mountain bikes and then full suspension mountain bikes and vertical specific kind of or use case specific bikes and all that sort of stuff. All of those massive advances in the technology of bikes definitely at each phase breathed new life into the industry. But I have never seen personally, I haven't ever seen quite the impact in my lifetime on the industry. I haven't seen the same level of impact as the e-bike movement has made on the industry. It has just transformed the entire industry, and it has made, I guess it is so radically expanded the use cases for bikes that is the impact, that, you know, and even down to the use case of, I don't know if you've ever heard of Ubco, another New Zealand company manufacturing utility bikes that are effectively almost a cross between a bicycle and a motorbike, but it's electric, and it's a utility bike that can be used for anything from pizza delivery to working on the farm. And, you know, that's almost blurred the lines between what a traditional bike is and who would sell that. Would a motorbike dealership sell that, or would a bicycle dealership sell that, or would they both sell it, because it straddles all those use cases? And so man, that whole modernization of the bike fleet through electrification is just mental.
Yeah. And one of the exciting areas for me, I think, is this last mile delivery kind of market where FedEx and DHL and companies like this are now being squeezed out of highly built up city or metropolitan areas, and they're having to look for alternatives for getting that cargo into its final hands. And these two-wheel, three-wheel, four-wheel light electric vehicles are proving to be incredible. And we've actually been approached by a group in Europe, in Germany in particular, called Noka Mobility. And what they're building is a platform for which manufacturers of cargo bikes and last mile delivery kind of light electric vehicles can source parts. And it's a marketplace, it's a directory, it's a procurement kind of service whereby small orders can be consolidated into larger orders. And so they're trying to unite the European bike manufacturing and light electric vehicle manufacturing. And they approached us about helping them to clear up and define some of the standards by which these components are being manufactured. Nobody can seem to agree on the correct axle width or the component that should be used. And so at the moment, the emerging micromobility market is a bit of a free-for-all, and everybody's making what they need and nobody can agree. There's no consensus on
There's no standards yet. It's the whole VHS versus beta thing all over again in every market, everywhere, all the time.
Exactly. They approached us several weeks ago now, and if we had something for that market, that they would buy it. And so that for us has effectively opened up our market, and we'll look at some of that as well. But as a proof of concept, the bicycle's where our current focus is. And yeah, it's very exciting and gives us an expanded vision to be looking at the opportunities that exist in the space that we're doing, such as the Tech Alliance model and the micromobility stuff. But we've obviously got to pull it back a little bit and try and focus on getting something out there. I'm not sure if either of you are aware, but we've built a prototype. It's effectively the ability to swap components on a bike and it tells me whether it's component or not. That was 6 months of hammering away at a spreadsheet with a bunch of formulas in it. And so now us bringing on this tech co-founder, that enables us to flesh that out and turn it into a database and some computational logic and develop some APIs that then help us integrate it into whatever software platform our customer may have.
Yeah, that's amazing. I think that where you've got so much opportunity from my perspective, there's so many adjacencies in your industry and what you're working on. It's ridiculous what the opportunity looks like. It's probably more of a harder decision about what you say no to than what you say yes to. And all the way from building out of the box integrations with e-commerce platforms, you could get into that space to where it's just plug and play for someone that subscribes via an app that automatically integrates with the e-commerce platform, all the way to doing partnerships with agencies that do those kind of custom integrations with e-commerce platforms, all the way to bespoke stuff that is off the shelf from you guys that can provide both the front end and the back end piece if they don't already have a suitable front end solution. So and also just the type of data that you aggregate and surface and sterilize and harmonize and rationalize globally, again, with all those adjacencies, just immediately outside of just bikes. The opportunity for you guys is pretty insane as I see it. And it's your hardest decision is, what does MVP look like for us and for the product that we're trying to build and take to market? What defining the MVP as part of a product roadmap and your initial go-to-market play is the hardest thing. It's so difficult. And I've helped platforms do this before, and I've worked through it before, and I'm working through it now with a few clients. And it's just such a challenge to define. It's so easy to get caught up. We could just add this one more thing. And if we just added this one more thing before we made it available, then it would open up so many more opportunities for us, and we could do so much more revenue. But then you get caught. That the catch 22 is then if you keep thinking that you'll never get it out there, even a V1, you'll never get it out there. You'll never get revenue coming in. You'll never be able to find perfect product market fit, because until something is in you might think you have the perfect vision of what MVP is for your product. You might even think you've got it narrowed down to a really tight MVP. But until it's in the wild and until it's being consumed either by even just some initial beta design partners and early access partners, until you start getting feedback from the market, you will not know whether you've hit the mark or not. And so it's such a catch-22 in the product development space. It really is.
And I think it's complicated by the fact that what we're trying to provide, the service we're providing, needs to be accurate. It needs to be reliable. People need to trust it, and it needs to cater for such a broad. The analogy I used for somebody is, okay, we're going to create the dictionary. Where do we start? Do we start with letter A, or do we provide a few words from each letter? What's going to be most useful for our customers right now?
Yeah. Big challenge. But look, with big challenges come big opportunities, because the reality is clearly nobody's done this before. And it's because it feels overwhelming. It feels daunting. It feels like the car parts into the vehicle parts industry, broadly speaking, has been working on this problem for almost 30 years. That's the reality. They're only just now really, and they still don't have it, 100% correct, and they still don't have global coverage, and they still don't have pan product nor pan vehicle coverage globally. You have fragmentation in the industry, and you have fragmented suppliers of data, and they've been working on this for a lot longer than you have, and they still don't get it. I remember before I left New Zealand and I was trying to get brake pads for my Lexus, and a super cheap auto uses several different databases, and I have the make, the model, the year of my vehicle, put it in. It told me, yep, this will absolutely fit your car, and neither the front nor the back brakes fit. And it was because during the model year of my vehicle with the IS350, they upgraded the brakes like halfway through the year, and the whole rotor assembly, the caliper assembly, and the brakes themselves were quite different. And in that particular exact model that I had. And so they said, look, you still need to bring those old pads in, and we'll pull them out of the box, and we'll make sure that they're exactly going to fit before you basically pay and take them away. And so I'm thinking, this industry has had a long time to get this right. And it's still not 100% perfect.
That's great, other than your vehicle being off the road for 3 days to 3 weeks while they match the pads. So
like you pull your pads out.
It still isn't good enough.
Yeah. I mean, I had them ordered and I had received, because I was doing the brake pads myself, and I don't do all the work on my cars myself, but that's easy enough for me to do. And I literally had the car up off the ground, and I had the front and the brake pads there. And I went to do I think it was the rears first, and they didn't fit. So I took my other vehicle down and swapped those out and got those all sorted out, and then went to do the fronts with the other set of brake pads that I thought were going to fit. because I couldn't pull them all off at once. And then they ended up being wrong. So again, back down to super cheap I went, and then they had to order them in. And yeah, like you say, it was off the road for a week and a half before I got both sets of pads and got them both installed. And then one of the calipers had to be rebuilt in the meantime. So that added extra time as well, because one of the calipers was stuck. Yeah, look, it's a super unique challenge, and you're going to have the same challenge in the sense that your data is not always going to be 100% perfect. And it's going to be about whoever consumes your data. They're going to have to put messaging in that functionality that says we try to be as accurate and complete with our data as possible, but it's never 100% accurate 100% of the time. And if it's not, and it doesn't work for you, we'll make it right, basically. And so that's up to the retailer, whoever's actually consuming your data and whoever's actually selling that product market fit for that product. It's up to them to create a user journey on the website that definitely helps the customer, but also makes it really transparent that we're going to occasionally get it wrong too, because it's a complex game. And you can't tell them to do that. They'll just have to figure that out for themselves, because you can't control every single deployment of your data, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. And I guess the other side of that is providing the avenue for them to then provide feedback to us. So whether it's from the customer, which is probably not my desired outcome, but at least for the e-commerce platform that we've sold our service to, we want to provide them some sort of guarantee that if there's a genuine mistake from our data perspective or our compatibility algorithm, that we'll cover the cost of return freight and we'll take that off their bill. But we want the opportunity to investigate it. We want you to provide us the information that we need, although we can probably look it up somehow. Provide us the information that we need so that we can investigate it, and then we'll use that information to update our records.
Exactly.
That's an important step.
Yeah, if you can close that loop, because I don't see that happening very much in the automotive industry, because it's so diffuse in terms of the way that data gets deployed in places where it gets deployed. Sometimes it's on marketplaces, sometimes it's on e-commerce websites, sometimes it's in catalogs, sometimes it's almost impossible to track all of the ways that this data gets deployed and the ways in which it gets exposed to the end consumer. It's almost innumerable. And as a result of that, sometimes the customer will never notify. They'll get a return, and then they'll either go somewhere else or they will sort it out themselves. They'll figure it out themselves by doing some Googling. They'll jump onto a forum. They'll say, oh, that's right, you need this brake pad. Here's a link to it on this website. So oftentimes the customer will jump through the hoops of trying to figure it out themselves, in which case you will never know why that product was actually returned to you, or how or what scenario led to them getting it wrong. And yeah, obviously incentivizing merchants who consume your data, to somehow incentivizing them to give you as much feedback as possible on every single instance where it fails their customer, I think is absolutely noble. I just think that it won't always be able to happen despite your best intentions.
Yeah. And I guess the other thing that we've done with our market approach is, in speaking to a couple of CEOs that have tried this before, they ended up scraping data from websites to gather their bike and parts information. We've chosen not to do that. What we're actually going to do is we're going to the bike manufacturers themselves and asking them to provide build lists of bikes. Ideally, if we can tie it to a serial number, that would be great. But we're in the very early stages of convincing the bike manufacturers, and these are big companies, to hand over that information. For us, it's all around creating those relationships and getting the data from the source as much as possible. If we don't have any luck doing it that way, then we've got the option to buy a bike database from 99 Spokes, which contains 77,000 bikes, and they'll sell it to us for $100,000. And if we get funding, then, that's our last resort. But the preference will be convincing the bike industry that they need this solution, and that
Yes.
the automotive industry 30 years down the track is a perfect example of why it's important for manufacturers to contribute. But yeah, we're yet to embark on that journey in any full-scale attempt with the bike manufacturers. That's something that we're just starting to dabble in now. We've gone the route of parts manufacturers, and we've got a number of notable parts manufacturers on board and data in our hands, which is great. We're starting to see a little bit of industry interest. So a couple of the industry magazines have reached out and said, oh, what are you guys doing? Tell us more. So we've got a couple of articles that are coming out in the next couple of months. So hopefully that leads us into a conversation with some bike manufacturers and gives us a little bit of credibility facility. We've also had a second chance at what's called the Cycling Innovation Accelerator. So it's a group of industry professionals, angel investors, and one very large bike-specific publishing company in Europe who have basically said, we want to help the cycling startup community. And so we've got enough funds here to bring a couple of really good products to market. We originally got passed over because they didn't think we were quite at the stage that they wanted us to be at. And the update that I was able to provide recently with our tech co-founder coming on board, our success with the parts manufacturers coming on board and supplying us with some product data and a couple of other things, they've been able to see the value in us as a team and the progress that we've made in a very short time. And they've said, yeah, we love your idea. We want you involved now. So we're now part of that shortlist. We've just submitted some more questions and answers and some very specific questions that they had for us. Yeah, and an updated pitch deck and whatnot. So yeah, we're hopeful. We've also had some interest from Hilferance as an investor. So I've got a meeting scheduled now in April for when one of their principals comes back from the USA. So that's a really good sign that he's planning that far ahead, and is that interest was sparked by an update that I sent him where I said, oh yeah, we've done this, we've done that, we've achieved this, and we're going out to the market for funding recently. And he came back and said, oh, well, let's have a catch up before you go too far down that path. So that's
wow, this is all positive. This is all positive stuff. And obviously, if investors can see movement and they can see progress and they can see effectively bootstrapped progress, which is what you've been doing up till now, that gives them the confidence that this means enough to you that regardless of whether you get funding or not, you're going to keep making progress, maybe slightly slower progress than if you had some rocket fuel in the tanks, but slow and steady. They would rather see progress over perfection, right? That's what they would rather see. And so I think that the fact that you're making progress on multiple fronts at the same time shows them that you are getting ever closer to that initial MVP launch of a platform, a technology, a set of IP, a set of data that then is going to be very useful and can be consumed on effectively a SaaS basis. So you're effectively going to be a productized software solution that, look, at the end of the day, the value is just as much in the software delivery mechanism and how you deliver the IP as the IP itself. So they go hand in hand. You can't, it's all great. It's all fine and good to have 1,000 spreadsheets. That's great, worth of data, but it's okay. How do we commercialize this in a way that makes sense for us, but also makes sense for the consumers of our data, which will be B2B enterprises in the bike space? I think the fact that you're making advances on all these fronts simultaneously, if I was in the space that you're in to want to invest, this would give me a lot of confidence that, hey, they're so passionate about this. One way or another, they're going to get to market with this thing, whether or not I invest. That's the first thing. Two, they're thinking about all the complexities of not only the IP and the sources of the data and some of the proprietary nature of the data and making sure that the bike manufacturer is on board with this, et cetera. But also, how are we going to deliver this in an efficient way that protects the IP, but also allows us to get paid, whether it's on a per API call basis, whether it's on a flat subscription basis. There's a number of ways this could be monetized. And so you have to think about the best way to monetize as well, or it's maybe a combination of 2 or 3 different methods of monetization depending on how the data gets consumed. And so I think that all of this stuff, if you're working on all this stuff simultaneously, it shows a significant commitment to the project.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned the monetization, because that was the question I had for you today. Was in redesigning our pitch deck, we want to be able to present a fairly clean model. We believe that we want to go down the route of an API call or per query kind of model, because what that does is gives us the ability to support the little guy in the same way that we support the big guy. And that's important to us. So looking at that model, but we're also looking at this case study that we did on Mountain Bikes Direct, who were effectively a company that both of us worked for. Lyndall now is customer service manager. I've left to do Bike Matrix full time. But that value of, if we can increase their conversion rates on parts by 30%, then we're increasing their revenue by $3.76 million a year. We're reducing their direct returns costs of about $27,000 a year, insignificant to the 3.7 million, but still worth considering. How do we put a dollar figure on supplying a solution to a customer like that. And I went through a really vague kind of process of, oh, we could charge them $20,000 a month. That's $240,000 a year. That in comparison to the 3.76 million in revenue, that's nothing. They'll buy that. It'll be sweet. That's what we're going to sell. Then a conversation I was having with, we've got a mentor called John Davies who works for Insured HQ, complete and utter bike nut, which is why we hooked up. And he said, what kind of profit are they working on? And I said, their margins on product vary between 20 and 50%, depending on the product, but their overall profit margin sits somewhere between 15 and 20%. Lyndall was able to confirm that with me yesterday. It's about 17%. So their overall profit is 17%. And he pointed out that if we're going to ask, I think it worked out to be about 6.5% of their increased revenue, that's probably a heavy sort of ask in terms of the profit that they're working on that increased revenue. That's about 40% of their profit. Most CEOs will give that the sniff test and down. I wondered, did you have any insights on how we calculate what our value is to that customer?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. And I think the secondary challenge, before I answer this, the secondary challenge you'll have is for the brands that want to lease the data effectively and put it into one of their systems, and as opposed to pulling it in real time from your APIs, they're going to want to pull it down once. They're going to want to associate it with their catalog as an attribute of a product, and they're going to say, okay, it works across this range of bikes, and so therefore when that bike is put in, then all of a sudden it's going to be able to dynamically filter in real time and say, I don't know, the brakes category, for example. That's where that sort of API use case starts to come unglued, because that's not how they're going to consume it. They're not going to consume it. Even if they consume it by API, they're going to consume it in one hit. They're going to refresh all of their data maybe weekly or something like that, or maybe monthly, or however, basically whenever you specify they have to refresh it, because you're going to run into the exact same problem that the auto manufacturers have and the parts manufacturers have, which is if a brand is not consuming our data in real time, then how frequently do they need to refresh it to make sure that it stays current? And this is the trick, right? This is the trick, because you're going to constantly be updating your data set to make sure it stays current, but you have to figure out some way to guarantee that the consumers of this data keep their data set that they have pulled down from you current. And this is the tricky bit. And so you could just simply, for phase one, you may simply say, we will require all consumers of our data to consume in real time connections to our API. That you may just say that. You may say they cannot store our data in any way, shape, or form. It's illegal for them to. Sure, they could pull it down and then start saving it. Each query that they make and each response that they get, a clever merchant could do that, and they could start saving that data to their own database and then re-aggregate it later in their product data management platform. Most won't. 99% of them won't, because they don't have the tech chops to even think of doing that. But once your data, it's very difficult to put the genie back in the bottle, is what I'm trying to say, is that even one breach of your data means that all of a sudden now it's out in the wild, and now it can be spread around by anyone. And all of a sudden now the IP doesn't have the same level of value that it does if it never makes it out of your system. But you got to strike a balance between making it easy to consume, but also protecting your IP. And that's a really difficult balance to strike. But I think definitely IP only access, at least for phase one, makes complete sense until you can assure yourself that you have the resources, effectively almost book publishers and audio publishers and music publishers and everything. They've got a whole phalanx of people going and issuing takedown notices and everything else all across the internet for people that have inappropriately used their data. But you won't have that to start with. And so keeping a really tight leash on access to your data is going to be the key.
I think, and I've had a couple of people comment on us doing it in a clever way, but I was mindful of that initially. And so I was mindful that the data that I keep, I refer to as fitment data. And unlike the automotive industry, where they're cross-referencing a bunch of original equipment manufacturer part numbers, the bike industry works on physical fitment information. So a wheel size or a hub spacing or a brake pad shape or a brake mount type, it's physical fitment information. And what it means is that it's a good thing for the industry, because what it means is that when you need to buy a replacement front wheel for your bike, it's not a specific front wheel that only fits your bike and 3 other bikes. It's a standard that can be fitted to thousands of bikes worldwide.
Yeah,
so
that's a massive difference.
But
Yeah,
it's also
huge difference.
yeah, it's also the thing that causes customers concern because there are a number of different standards and they're not stamped on the component. So when a customer has $1,000 bike that they've bought from their local 99 bikes shop, they've got no idea what model caliper their brake might be or what hub standard or what bottom bracket they need. And so this is the value in our product. What I've done is I've structured the data in such a way that any bike has a unique ID. And that unique ID is tied to a make, model, year, spec level. So 15 Giant Trance 3 is a very particular bike that has a number of particular components on it. Those components have all got product IDs or SKUs in our system. Those components are then what have the fitment information recorded against them. So effectively, when a customer goes browsing through a range of SKUs for, let's say, brake pads, those SKUs in our database have fitment information that means nothing to anybody but us. And so when a customer says, I have this bike and I want to go shopping for brake pads, a completely made up unique bike ID is talking to the SKU. It goes back to our database and references fitment information, and the answer comes back true or false.
Actually
Based on
releasing the data.
yeah,
So
it doesn't mean anything. They couldn't cross-reference it in the same way that you can because there's pieces of the data that they do not have access to. The key is not accessible to them. They only need to know, does this work for my bike?
That's
and
correct.
the other great thing about the way that you're doing this is, so for example, you've got this make, model, year specific variant of bike. For example, what the factory hub is for that, or the factory wheel size, or the factory brake pad, specifically down to if it's a Shimano, et cetera, pad, the model. But you also know the specs of that pad, for example, and then in your database, you can create a cross-reference. Now that you know the specs of that pad, the size, the width, the height, everything of that entire component, then you can also create a cross-reference between that make and model of that, say, brake pad, and you could say an equivalent in this other manufacturer's brake pad we know will fit because we know the specs of the OEM brake pad and we know the specs of the aftermarket brake pad that third-party brake pad that would fit in the same carrier, for example. So you have the ability to take the OEM parts, and by knowing the standard of the specs of that part, you can create cross-references that no one else can.
That's right. And the other way we do it is that we're not just, if somebody's looking for brake pads, we're not just looking at the brake pads that came on the bike. We're looking at the brake caliper that came on the bike. We're looking at the disc rotor that came on the bike. And we're showing them all of the pads that will fit that caliper and that disc rotor, and away we go. So that's a unique way that the fitment information gives us the ability to show them alternatives, as opposed to the cross-referencing of OEM that the automotive industry have to do.
Yeah, that makes sense. But the thing is that whilst if you were consuming that via API, that fixes your challenge. If you release fitment information en masse that says, okay, for this bike, these 5 different brake pads will work with this bike, then if you released that, say, for example, via CSV, or you released it in another fashion that a brand could consume and associate in their own systems, then they never need to know what your unique key is, but the data is still out there in the wild. The fitment data is still out there and the cross-reference data is still out there in the wild. And you do want to prevent that. So long as you require them to connect to your API in real time, almost like a plate lookup in the automotive world, it's the same type of thing. They're telling you, here's my vehicle, which is my bike. Here's the make, model, year of my bike, which is the same thing as a plate lookup in the auto world. The plate tells Tech Alliance, for example, the plate lookup tells them, this is the make, model, and year of this vehicle in Australia, for example. And then that's the call that's made based on the plate to make, model, year, and variant lookup. That cross-referencing then tells Tech Alliance, okay, this is the air filter from Fram that will fit this vehicle. For all intents and purposes, by them giving you the make, model, and variant of their make, model, year, and variant of the bike, then that is effectively the plate lookup for you that then allows you to pull the data in real time for all the components that will fit based on the catalog that they have available on their site. Because one retailer might carry 3 different brands of brake pads and another retailer might carry 6 different brands of brake pads. And so long as you have all 6, for example, then you can meet the needs of the guys that carry the 3 brands of brake pads, and you can meet the needs of the retailers that carry all 6 brands of brake pads, because you know the SKU, because you're using the same SKU reference as they're using from the manufacturer, from the supplier. And it's the SKU, because you don't need a VIN, you don't need a plate, you just need make, model, year, variant of vehicle. That allows you to be very specific down to the SKU level of product that will fit that bike. And so you're in a very unique position. You're in a very, very unique position. It's the cross-referencing capability of your data that really, in my opinion, adds the most value of all. Sure, you can tell them the OEM component that came with that bike and say, yeah, sure, you can go get the OEM brake pad. But what happens if the retailer is out of stock on the OEM part, but they do have something else that would work in its place and they can sell it right now, which will increase the conversion rate of the website, and it will decrease cart abandonment as a result, because you're offering them the next best option for their bike. And you can even call out the fact, okay, here's the OEM part, this is the OEM SKU, but here's ones that will fit in place of that. And that, to me, is the true value of your data. And I think as long as you stick to an API access monetization model, at least for phase 1, I think then the chances of that data getting out are limited. And that's going to protect your IP, which is really where the value is.
Yep, absolutely.
And it allows you to also dynamically scale. So let's say, I don't know whether you're going to host it, whether you're going to build your app on top of, say, for example, Airtable, or whether you're going to build it completely custom and host it in AWS, or I don't know the full architecture of your system yet. And I think you're still working through some of that. But the great thing about API access is that whatever your nominal cost of delivering the API call, you can add an appropriate margin that then is flexible for you. You can your cost or your charge out for API access in line with any additional cost increases that might come to you from the hosting supplier or the platform vendor in the case of Airtable. And so I think that model allows you to scale, as you say, it allows you to scale both the size of clients that you can take on, meaning the size of retailers, all the way from the tiniest single corner shop all the way up to the biggest multi-store chains in the world. It allows you to scale that way, but it also allows you to control your costs by saying, okay, we're only going to charge for the calls that we receive, which we're then going to on-bill to the end customer plus a suitable margin for us. And so it allows you to, instead of having to overbuild infrastructure to begin to cater for all these different ways that your data might be accessed, you're scaling alongside your customers scaling. And you can set up the infrastructure to auto scale behind the scenes without you having to touch it as the number of calls increase to your infrastructure. So I think that model is totally scalable, and that's the way a lot of systems do it. It's the way a lot of SaaS platforms do it. So it's very reasonable. It's a pretty well-known model in the industry.
Yeah, we're definitely looking at a kind of serverless tech stack based on Azure or AWS. We're still trying to decide whether or not what we're trying to do needs anything special, or whether we can just go with a standard kind of SQL database. But yeah, it's exciting to be at that stage where we're actually going to pick a platform and actually start building something. I've done a lot of work behind the scenes to build out what's it called? An entity relationship diagram, basically building out the fields that I want in each of the product category tables. And yeah, seeing all that come together is going to be pretty exciting. The other thing I did want to say in terms of the way that we've structured our data, one of the most exciting features that we're going to be able to provide, because we're doing that, because the bike ID relates to a frame and a bunch of components that are stored separately. What it means is that when you decide that you want to change any component on your bike through our consumer app, you have the ability to update your particular bike and receive a custom ID. So if you wanted to go and buy a $4,000 carbon road bike frame and build a bike out of components, A, you can use our product to do that. B, you can then scan all of the barcodes and potentially build your bike virtually, and our product will give your bike a unique ID. And what that means is you can take that unique bike ID anywhere you want to shop, as long as they subscribe to our service. You can plug that bike ID in, and now you're looking at compatibility between components for your individual customized bike.
Wow. And presumably that will also be an API endpoint that someone could consume and effectively provide a bike builder on their side. They would have to build the UX experience to front that, but they could then, from their catalog of parts, they could effectively create a bike builder on their website that people could effectively drag and drop components and put it on their site, however they want to create the UI UX for that. And then effectively, when they get done and they make that purchase, they could let the customer know, we've actually registered this with this service, and this is your unique bike ID based on what you've built. So that way, should you ever need to come back to us and you want to replace components, want to update components, upgrade components, whatever, you're able to do that by a unique lookup ID, almost like a plate ID on a car.
Right.
And now this is going to make your life so much easier if you ever want to upgrade or replace parts on your bike.
Absolutely. And I had a meeting with Rob. I can't remember his surname now. It's a funny one, but he runs a bike marketplace called Bike List. And that idea appealed to him because that bike ID can then be transferred to the next person that buys that bike, and
Right.
they go shopping for parts. It could potentially give them the spec list of that bike. So rather than like eBay, if you want to sell your bike, you've now got to list all of the things that are part of that bike and remember what they were. Now you just provide your bike matrix bike ID and we can provide that spec list for them.
Wow, absolutely amazing. An opportunity around this, around auto-generating QR codes with that ID that then can automatically look up, or an NFT that could be associated with that build, so that way you can even transfer ownership via NFT when you sell your bike, that then's got the embedded bike matrix ID within it. Look, there's so many opportunities here. Like I said, the reality is what you say no to is going to be more important than what you say yes to. I think especially in the early stages, because you've got so many opportunities to commercialize this and really add value well beyond the commercialized part of this, because there'll be a consumer facing app that doesn't cost the consumer anything to use, but what it does is it creates a community around your services that then adds more value to the merchants that consume your services and surface them back to the customer. And so this to me is the key. You're building demand in two ways. You're building demand by having the merchants build demand for you, because this service creates a better experience for their customers. But secondarily, you're effectively building grassroots demand at the end consumer level by providing a consumer-facing app that adds all this additional value for free, doesn't cost the consumer anything, doesn't cost the merchant anything to leverage the value of your consumer-facing app. To me, this feels just, you're going to have the massive network effects by attacking through two lenses the market, the end consumer and the value you bring to them at no charge, and then also the value that you bring to the merchant and the enhanced customer experience. And those together are just like a 1-2 punch from my perspective.
Yep, we agree. The plan at the moment is to focus on New Zealand, top 5 or so bike brands, maybe the last 5 years, and maybe one product category. So let's say brake pads. So what we're looking to do, and we've already spoken to Evo Cycles, which Jason, you'll be familiar with, Simon, local chain of family-owned bike shops here. They've got 30 stores across New Zealand. So the biggest New Zealand bike store chain. They've expressed definite interest in beta testing this with us once we've got a product to test. And so basically what we'll do is we'll look at their brands that they sell and provide some sort of brake pad finder. It'll go live on their site. Maybe we'll even set up iPads at the brake pad display in store and get customers using it and find out how useful it is. That way we can obviously add bikes to it. We can then add product categories to it while it's still essentially in operation, and expand on it and see where the value lies.
Wow. Absolutely amazing. We've monopolized Simon's time on the call, but it's been super interesting, and I'm very excited about where you've gotten with this, Adam. I'm really excited for you. It's awesome to hear the progress that you've made, and even from a business development and go-to-market perspective, you've made a lot of progress just in the last few weeks since we spoke last.
Yeah.
And also from a management team perspective and team structure, and even from a tech perspective, it sounds like you've got a much more clear perspective on where you want to take this. And that makes me, the pace with which you're doing this is really inspiring. So well done, really well done. Congratulations.
Love hearing that. Thank you.
Now, Simon, for you, because someone who's relatively new to this space, I guess if we look back across your background, and I know Jace really targets the e-com space, or at least omnichannel merchants, but in particular e-commerce merchants, and he's all about unit economics. He's all about sustainable, scalable growth. He's all about not overly discounting. He's all about, Jace is really, I guess because he's also invested in some e-commerce brands, and he has a firsthand experience. He's got skin in the game on some e-commerce brands retailers that he works with. And so that gives him a first row seat to what it takes to run a successful, scalable, sustainable e-commerce business. So he's not just an accountant, and he's not just providing financial services to brands, but he's running brands too. And so from my perspective, you can't learn any better, or the learnings that stick with you the most are the ones that you have first-hand experience with.
A lot of what we're learning at the moment is the shit that doesn't work.
Exactly. And so for
That's
you,
what learning is, isn't it?
Exactly. It's all the failures. You learn more from your failures than your successes, I reckon, every time. Once bitten, twice shy, so to speak. But from your perspective, because you're relatively new to the organization, right?
I joined SBA. Yeah, it's been really interesting. So, Adam, about 40% of our current client base is e-commerce, and of that 40%, I think about 90% are on the Shopify. All that do Shopify, Amazon, et cetera, but predominantly Shopify. The rest of them are digital agencies and SaaS businesses. So they're the three, I guess, target markets for us. So I really enjoyed this conversation. It's good to see what it's like when you write it at the start, because usually when I talk to a SaaS founder, it's to the point where we're ready for Series A or something like that, and we've got no finance infrastructure in place whatsoever. That's typically where we join the conversation. So it's really good to see it like right back at the beginning where it actually starts, because all we hear is a 5-minute story of how they got to that point. So it's been really good to get into another level of granularity. I've really enjoyed it.
That's awesome. Yeah. And also have a listen. I don't know if you follow my podcast, but definitely have a listen, because, I focus primarily on tech and ops on my podcast. And that means by extension, I'm mostly working with SaaS, e-com, omnichannel, and retail tech founders, leaders, vendors, that sort of thing. And the cool thing about that is that I get them all the way from pre-launch all the way through to very mature, the most successful in their category software vendors and everything in between. And it's so cool to hear their stories about how they came to be. Were they scratching an itch? Did they need the platform themselves? Did they just see a gap in the market and go, we're going to close that gap because it's a blue ocean opportunity? Did they see that somebody else was already out there doing it, but doing a real shit job of it, and they thought they could do a better job of it and provide a better platform and a better product? And so therefore they just thought, bugger it, I'm going to do it. And a lot of those are Shopify specific apps, because the app ecosystem for Shopify is the biggest in the world, over 8,000 apps in the app store. It's by far the largest in the e-commerce space. And yeah, I think that you would get a lot of value out of the pod, and just listening to the stories of some of these software founders and how they got to be where they are, how they found success. Many of them have had to pivot over the lifespan of their platform, of their product, to find better product market fit over time. Some of them have completely changed their go-to-market model. Some of them have completely changed their pricing model. Some of them have completely changed the tiering of their pricing. So it's such an interesting and dynamic industry, and consumer expectations are constantly changing. And what that means is that the expectations of the merchants, and therefore the vendors that service them, are constantly changing. And so that's this industry you will never, ever get bored in. It's so cool to see both experiences that merchants are trying to create to build a sustainable business. It's awesome to see the software vendors out there really trying to make their lives easier. And then, of course, you get the investor class, which is trying to make money off of all of this, but also to put rocket fuel in the rocket. And obviously, we've got SVB and the implosion there. We've got all the stuff coming out of the States. And we already had a real chill across the VC and PE environment over the last, say, 12 months with the economic downturn and rising interest rates. But it's going to be very interesting to see what happens over the next 12 months. I know a couple of founders that are in the fundraising mode. And man, it is the difference in challenges in even having conversations and getting airtime with VCs versus, say, mid to late 2021. It is so stark. It may as well be another century, because the reality is that the ability in mid to late 2021, the market was so frothy that oftentimes VCs were investing before a vendor had even remote product market fit. Even in the conceptual stage, they were trying to get in so early, and there was so much competition for deal flow that they were just throwing money at the wall to see what stuck, because of course money was free at that point. And
Yeah.
now the market is so radically different. Here in Mexico, the central bank's interest rate is over 11%. So
Wow.
when you look at that and the strength of the peso, so we're not just talking about the cost of funds, but we're talking about the meta impact of the cost of funds. And we're talking about things like, for example, how the AUD and NZD are getting, and for that matter, even the USD are getting crushed versus the peso. The peso has rocketed. The NZD versus peso is down over 22% in the last 12 months versus the peso. And so when we think about the meta impact of these kinds of things, it's even in affecting people flows. Because what I'm hearing here in Mexico is that the rising peso versus the dollar versus the NZD, AUD, et cetera, is going to put an absolute massive thaw on inbound immigration, because now all of a sudden the cost to migrate is so much higher, but also what used to be a really low cost of living country is pretty rapidly rising because their interest rates, headline rates are so high here. And therefore investors, the capital inflow coming into, it's a compounding effect, right? So they already had incoming capital flows into Mexico as nearshoring happened out of China, for example, into Mexico because of COVID. And so there was a whole lot of capital pouring into this country. Tesla's building a plant here. There's a whole bunch of auto manufacturing plants being built here at the moment. We were taking a bus from Mexico City to Querétaro, where we are now, and I saw a Tremec factory, which is a major transmission manufacturer for cars. This factory, which is literally in the middle of nowhere, was like the size of 4 football fields. It's just amazing the amount of industry that is being established here because of its close proximity to the United States. Now, of course, it's nothing like China, but it's happening, and there's a lot of capital flowing in. And then, of course, there's a lot of capital flowing in just because of that headline interest rate and the yield that you get. 4.75, I think, is the average interest rate now. The Reserve Bank of New Zealand, I think it's about 4.75 or something like that now. If I could buy treasuries in New Zealand versus buying treasuries in Mexico, the only reason I wouldn't buy treasuries in Mexico versus New Zealand is maybe that I would think New Zealand is maybe more secure and stable. But is it? I don't know. And so the reality is that there's been capital flight from all around the world into Mexico because of the high interest rates to try to get a handle on inflation in Mexico. And we're now at 11%. There's a big gap between 4.75% treasuries in New Zealand and 11% treasuries in Mexico. So there's this compounding global meta effect of interest rates, inflation, tech advancements, build out. Some of these build outs of tech infrastructure take 3, 4, 5, 7 years to come to fruition. But once they come online, that starts to create even more capital inflows. And so it's the global impacts of some of these things happening, the war in Ukraine, all these things happening are just, it's fascinating to watch and have a front row seat for.
Yeah, for sure.
And I fancifully, before I left New Zealand, when I was watching both the New Zealand and the Australian dollar, for that matter, get an absolute pounding, I affectionately referred to them as the South Pacific peso. It's pretty funny to watch.
But it's interesting that you mentioned the nearshoring, because I'm starting to see that as well. I'm starting to see bigger investment and marketing strategies geared towards products being made locally, and particularly for North America, being made in Mexico. I think China's had its run on particularly the bike industry manufacturing side of things. It seems to shift to wherever the labor is cheapest, and Taiwan had a pretty good run on it. But I think now we're going to start seeing some manufacturing done a little closer to home. An announcement from Ride Cake. Cake are a Swedish brand, I believe, who make motorbikes and pedelecs, really high-end stuff, nice quality gear. They've just announced a partnership with a Mexican manufacturer, and their initial contract is to make 50,000 units. It's not to be sneezed at, and that's directly aimed at the North American market. And 5 years ago, that was unheard of.
Yeah, we're seeing that even in the chip space, where a lot of the chip manufacturers, Foxconn and a few of the other major chip manufacturers supplying to the likes of Apple and a whole lot of other, and to Samsung, they're nearshoring or I guess it's probably similar distance, but what they're doing is they're de-risking their dependence on China by moving to India. And they're building a whole bunch of new factories. They're building new chip foundries in India and pouring. Each chip foundry is ridiculous. I think it's $10 billion or something stupid like that. The amount of capital that goes into some of these ventures is so staggering. It's figures that are hard to even comprehend or to put into any kind of reasonable comparison. But we're seeing some global reshuffling of supply chains at grand scale now. And I think it's all in the name of better decentralization of supply chains more than anything else. We had a lot of globalization of supply chains. But what that meant was, we think of globalization as it being almost an even split of where manufacturing and capital and resources and human resources are going to be coming from. But what globalization did is it centralized all manufacturing in one or two places is really what it did. And there was really almost zero, pre-COVID, was almost zero resiliency in certain supply chains. And in certain verticals had over reliance on certain countries. So not all manufacturing was done in China. For example, in the fashion space, a lot of garment manufacturing was centralized in Indonesia, Vietnam. If you were in shoes, for example, Indonesia's very huge into the shoe manufacturing vertical. In Vietnam, they specialize in certain manufacturing of certain products. There were certain places around the world that specialized in maybe one or two verticals of products. And I think what we're seeing now is that major brands realize now that they have to have not only resiliency in supply chain, but they have to have massive redundancy in supply chain. And they realize that, okay, sure, we may lose tiny amounts of economies of scale by having manufacturing done in two places, but the benefit to us in terms of even being able to play those suppliers off of each other as a contract manufacturer is so valuable to us, and being able to de-risk our supply chain dependency that we're willing to pay the penalty for that slightly increased price. And we'll just pass that on to our customers, which is what everybody's doing, which is why we're getting inflation. That's one of the contributors to inflation, is the fact that resiliency in supply chains is becoming a very big topic of conversation, and brands just realize we just have to pay that penalty to have that resiliency.
Yeah, and that resiliency was certainly highlighted by the pandemic in the bike industry, and we're highly publicized in what they call the bullwhip effect at the moment, with the undersupply and high demand leading to increased production, which now the demand has cooled and everything's oversupplied. And so you're seeing now in the bike industry the effects of that, and layoffs and closures. And one of the UK's largest distributors went into receivership just today, and for the first time ever specialized bikes by 25 to 30%. And so the industry's noticing that it's in a bit of turmoil.
Yeah, specialized. I've never really, I'm not a big bike fan, or necessarily, I definitely am not a specialist in bikes, but I've never known Specialized to be a discount brand by any stretch of the imagination. They have such incredible pricing power in the industry and such a big brand name globally, that to hear the fact that they're not only that they're discounting, but discounting so significantly, that is pretty earth-shattering.
Yeah.
If you'd like to get mentored by Jason for free, head over to greenwoodconsulting.net, scroll to the bottom of the page, and click Get Mentored by Jason.